All right. According to a former interview with 3AM, it was called, you first became interested in philosophy when your dad gave you Descartes' Meditations in the fifth or sixth grade. What was it that gripped you about it?
The idea that we could be living in an illusion, right?
So it was so that was that sort of a shock to you? I mean, was that a like a red pill moment, as they say nowadays?
A red pill. I mean, with the Matrix, the red pill, green,
Right.
blue pill. Uh, well, I mean, it's the combination of the kind of metaphysical shock, but also the uh, realization that there was not an intellectual way out of it. That you can't, you can't think your way through this, or you can't that all options seemed closed off in terms of establishing what seemed like the most obvious things.
Right, right. Yeah, I remember having that experience with Hume when we were made to read him for the first time. Now, in the same interview, it said that you took 2 years working in a non-profit in DC after undergraduate. Would you care to say what it was, and why was it that you did that instead of grad school, and why was it that you stopped doing that and then went to grad school?
Um, so the nonprofit was called the Ethics Resource Center. It was an interesting, I don't think it still exists, but it was an interesting combination. Its bread and butter was corporate consulting for an ethical environment. And it had almost no philosophical interest, but I think it did a lot of good work. I mean, it was more or less straight up corporate consulting, but looking at what they called values and vulnerability. So productivity, if you have a manufacturing company, productivity and safety are always going to be conflicting values. So they would identify those points of conflict and advise management on how to avoid ethical, ending up on the front page or what have you. I worked with a smaller, so that group made some money. I worked with a group that spent some money making videos, classroom for K through 12 classroom videos about being a good kid. So I did that. I wasn't interested in going to graduate school.
Why
I was,
not? Why not?
I'm not sure, actually. I was definitely encouraged to go to graduate school. Um, but
Was it that you felt like you wanted to make a difference?
I definitely felt that I wanted to make a difference. It wasn't, though, that I was going to do that in any large way, doing this nonprofit thing that I did.
Yeah, you didn't
That,
join the Peace Corps or anything.
yeah, I mean, I was placed there by a fellowship. There was an organization of alumni that would, network graduates with nonprofits, and so I found my way there through that network. Um, but yeah, I'm not. I could ask my teachers what I said to them when they asked me to go to graduate school. But then, as I was doing the work for the nonprofit, I realized that I was put in charge of producing the print materials and doing some research on childhood development and the development of moral personality. And I realized that what I enjoyed the most was that work. Going to the library, writing things, the same, and that's what made me realize, oh, actually, probably I should go back to graduate school.
So, was it that experience that directed you in grad school? I mean, did you go to grad school and say, okay, this is what I want to do? I want to talk about moral psychology, because that is
Hmm.
an area you've ended up in.
No, I mean, my interest in the very things that I am still writing about today predates that. As an undergraduate, I needed to write a senior thesis, and there's more or less a straight line from the questions I was asking then to the things I'm still doing however many decades later. Um, so, um, I think it was just good luck that the research they asked me to do at this nonprofit had some relation to those issues.
Okay. And when you got to grad school, did you quickly fall in with a particular professor, or did you have a particular class that really sparked your interest and sort of said, okay, that settles what my dissertation is going to be on, or did you sort of bounce around a little bit?
I bounced around a little bit. In my second year, I realized there were terrific classes being offered in epistemology and metaphysics, but in my second year, I realized that I really should stick with ethics. That that's where my interests were, and that's where I had motivation to work hard. And so I did. And then one of my undergraduate teachers, Richard Moran, at that point moved to Harvard. So then I had somebody who I was familiar with there. But yeah, I mean, I kicked around a little bit, but fairly quickly settled into taking every course that Course Guard offered, and getting to know the. I just missed getting a class with John Rawls, which was a disappointment.
Yeah, that is. When I was in grad school, it's sort of you could. I had two professors who were students of Rawls, and one of them, your colleague Barbara Herman, had him while he was sort of in the interim between his political philosophy phases. So she got him in the Kantian ethics phase, and then Sharon Lloyd was when he was back doing political philosophy again. One of your earliest articles is on forgiveness. Now, was this sort of a one-off thing that you thought maybe this is a little problem that I can isolate and settle absent other concerns, or did you already see it as sort of part of a grand theory or a web of projects?
It's a great question. It turned out to be a smaller problem, so it turned out to be a good first paper for that reason. But that's not why I went there. I was at that point thinking that I was going to write a dissertation on things you don't do for reasons. There are things for which there aren't reasons, and so faith, hope, and love, something like that. And I had thought that forgiveness might be one of those, and then as I worked on it, I realized it's not one of those. But I had created this paper that I was encouraged then to send off to a journal, and so that's. And then I'm often asked if I would write more, and I don't feel I have more to say on that topic. But I am surprised when I go back to it, again, how much of the subsequent work I've been doing about attitudes and about the wrong kind of reason for attitudes is actually in that paper, just without all of the machinery to highlight it.
So are you going to, at the moment, you're working on a book. How's that going, by the way?
I'm working on two, actually. So I have a little book on Strawson's Freedom and Resentment, a close read of that, that is nearly ready to go to press.
A much neglected paper.
Yeah, I'm excited about this manuscript. I'm convinced that the main argument of the paper has not been understood by the ethicists, at least. Okay. In kind of a big way. And so I spend nearly 100 pages, I spend nearly 80 pages walking through his few pages very, very slowly and drawing on other parts of his corpus to try to say exactly what's on his mind. And then I spend the last, which I think that he has an underlying metaphysics of morals that's that to most ethicists will look like a non-starter. And then at the end, I try to defend that to make it seem like it's not a non-starter, which I think it isn't, to show that that's a contender. So I'm excited about that book. It should be out in 2020. And then I have what I think of as my big book, Minds That Matter, on the free will problem, moral responsibility and free will. That is going well. I have a full draft of it, but especially it kind of falls into two halves, and especially the back half, a lot of it's still pretty new. So I think I'm going to sit on that for a little bit, present pieces of it around, do the usual thing of allowing it to mature in response to feedback. So I think that's still a couple years off.
A lot of that, from looking at the introduction, which you've made available, it does seem like a lot of, at least the first half, is drawing on papers that you've already written, the articles you've been doing. So it seems like it's now bringing them all together, because one of the problems that no doubt you face is that every time you write an article, you have to say, here's all the other stuff I bring to bear to this article.
That's right.
That I can't really talk about now, but go read these other articles, and you have to try and make yourself contained. Whereas the beauty of a book is you can just say, well, as we've just been talking about in the previous chapter.
Exactly.
The Strawson one, it is funny. We had a position for an ethicist a few years back in our department, and I got to look at all their applications, and I was just amazed at how ethics had changed since I was in grad school. It had been, we were still talking about hair and people like that. And of course, Aristotle, Kant, and utilitarians and so on. Whereas now it all seemed to be, the Holy Grail was the Strawson article, which was surprising to me. When I was an undergraduate, the first lecture I ever went to, the introductory lecture for our year of incoming freshmen, was given by Strawson. I have to tell you, not a very dynamic speaker. But I read Strawson as an undergraduate, but it was all his stuff on philosophy of language. And then he writes this paper, which he admits is like, this is the only paper I'm going to write on ethics, and he writes it very quickly. And it's sort of, it's good, it's obviously good. And then it sort of fades into the background a bit. And then all of a sudden, wham, it's like the most important article of the 20th century, according to this huge group of thinkers who work on this topic. Do you have a theory about why that is? He does say at one point, what is it? The moral sentiments, an unjustly neglected area, or something like that.
Yep.
So you think that's people have suddenly become interested in that because of him, or just become interested in it and then discovered him, or why is it suddenly the bee's knees?
I think it's complicated. The main thing that people mean when they talk about Strawson or the Strawson article or Strawsonians has to do with the reactive attitudes and the contrast between the reactive attitudes and a more objective attitude, and that itself is a kind of fascinating and fecund distinction or idea. And so,
in the article it's not clear that he just says there are these things, the reactive attitudes, that I'm going to use to say why compatibilism seems to work. Oh, well, he wouldn't put it that way, but I've forgotten his weird way of putting it, but why we don't have to worry about the panicky metaphysics of the incompatibilists. So it's almost like, here's this thing that people don't really talk about that helps us talk about the free will problem, which was a big deal back then as now. Whereas people have just said, oh my God, it's like you discovered gold and then you ignored it. Is that?
Well, so I think that yeah, it's complicated. So one reason has to do with an interest coming from not just Scanlon and his contractualism, but then a similar thing has been picked up by Darwall with his second personal standpoint. Wallace is now talking about the moral nexus. So these are all accounts of morality that are focusing on interpersonal relations. And the Strawson article is pointed to as a kind of beginning, or as a touchstone for that kind of approach. And that's not incorrect. But and I'd like to be able to say, but it has nothing to do with the argument he gives. That's not true. It does, but it's a pretty deep. I mean, the argument he gives, as I understand it, relies on an idea about. It relies on the claim that we adopt the objective attitude in outlier cases. And it's impossible for everyone to be an outlier, and
okay,
that's why determinism isn't relevant.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
So just in case someone is unfamiliar with this article, who would these people be? But just in case, the objective attitude is when you treat someone as if from a God's eye point of view. Instead of interacting them, it's as if you step back and say, oh yes, this person is clearly crazy, so we don't have to interact with them as a fellow person. We can just treat them as we would a mad dog or something like that. And this is, to take this attitude is something we can't even bring ourselves to do in most cases, and is a terribly objectifying attitude. Obviously, objectifying attitude to take towards someone, right?
Yeah, I think it's not. I mean, that's the most extreme version of it. But he allows that it's also what we do. It's to step away from the engaged attitudes of resentment or indignation or gratitude, and to treat someone like an issue or a problem or a. Right,
so you can still talk to them and interact with them. It's just I'm not going to let their bullshit get to me, kind of thing.
Right, and he thinks we do that sometimes, just because somebody's having a bad day, so they're being mean today, but because they're having a bad day, I'm not going to react to it. I'm just going to, they're under extreme stress, he says, or children. He thinks we have a kind of partially objective way of relating to them because of the immaturity. And then in the most extreme cases, yes, it would be the kind of thing you described.
I wonder what Galen Strawson has to say about that. Well, actually, we know what Galen Strawson has to say about that.
Yeah.
I'm going to, obviously Strawson is going to come up again, but I'm going to read the first sentence of your introduction to Minds That Matter.
Okay.
Incidentally, that title makes it sound a little bit like it's a philosophy of mind work, which of course it isn't primarily. Are you going to have a subtitle?
I probably should have a subtitle. It has some pretty strong implications in philosophy of mind.
As you say, the immodest ambition of this book is to unwind the traditional problem of free will and moral responsibility. Now, again, for the uninitiated, could you lay out the traditional problem?
So the first chapter works on that. The first two chapters actually are sketching the various problems that go under that head. But most basically, the problem is if our science can explain everything that happens, at least in the macro-physical world, how is it that we're free or responsible? If what I do can be explained by facts about either nature or nurture and my environment, tracing back ultimately to before I was born, then it seems that what I do isn't up to me. It seems like I'm not, and so it can seem that I'm not responsible. It can in fact seem that nothing really matters. So that's in a nutshell, that's the problem.
Now, Strawson, of course, was tackling this problem, and also another famous mid-ish century response to this is from Harry Frankfurt. You don't think that Frankfurt's method works. Frankfurt's response works. Could you say a little bit about your take on his response, because it has been so influential or caused such debate, and what you think is lacking? Is that an unfair request, or?
No. So the Frankfurt's first paper, Alternate Possibilities of Moral Responsibility, on the first paper on this topic, presents a counterexample, and I think the counterexample doesn't work. Okay. I suspect he has to think the counterexample doesn't work because he contributes. It prompts a massive literature to which he contributes not one letter, and instead, I think that example revealed an intuition that was important that he pursued. And the intuition was, if I wouldn't have done so the counterexample is in a counterexample to what gets called the principle of alternate possibilities, which is that if I'm morally responsible, then I could have done otherwise. And the intuition he has is, well, suppose I wouldn't have done otherwise, even if I could have. And he gives an example. If I wouldn't have done otherwise, even if I could have, why should the fact that I couldn't have, if you take away that possibility, why should that matter for moral responsibility?
Which is sort of what Locke had already made that point. Right?
Yes, it is Locke's point. So then he starts to, so you could say the insight is that what matters for moral responsibility is in some way whether what I did was what I really wanted to do. But then, of course, all the work is in the really. And his later work is trying to work out what it would be to really want to do something in a way that's sufficient for moral responsibility. And so at that point, he starts talking about hierarchies of desires. So what it is to really want to do something is to want it, and to want it, and to have no conflict in it. So that's interesting and fascinating and worth a long, hard think about. In the end, I don't think it's what's required for responsibility, because you can be responsible even when you're conflicted. So his view and Gary Watson's similar view have a hard time with ordinary weakness of will, giving into temptation. But I do think that looking at the sophisticated way in which we relate to our own mind is the right direction to go to. So what happens in the first part of the book, a lot of which has not been published before, surprisingly to me, I thought I was going to be doing a lot more repackaging but I ended up having to do a lot of new work. But one thing that happens is to go through some of the attempts by Frankfurt, by Watson, by Charles Taylor, and then to suggest a simpler way in which we are in control of our own wills. So that to suggest that just by being able to answer questions, that puts us in a kind of control over ourselves.
So what you're getting to is your notion of evaluative control. Now, to introduce that, you contrast that with the ordinary notion of control. So could you make that contrast?
Sure. So the ordinary notion of control is the kind of control we enjoy over our own actions and over ordinary objects. So if I am controlling my piece of chalk or my coffee cup, I have in mind a way I want that to be, and I control it to the extent that I can bring it to be as I would have it to be. So that ordinary notion has what I call a two-part structure. There's the thing controlled, the coffee cup, or my future behavior, and there's the activities by which I bring that to be, to match my idea of how I would have it to be. I impose my will on it. If you're thinking about the ordinary, if the only kind of control you have is, if the only notion of control you have is that one that has this two-part structure of controlling activity and object of control, you'll then have a worry. You might wonder how it is that the controlling activity is in your control. We're sophisticated, reflective creatures, so one thing we can do is think about our own activity and make it into a higher order object of control. That's Frankfurt's. I'm now returning a little bit to the what's no good about Frankfurt, what's the weakness in Frankfurt. So I think that kind of reflective idea that we can stand back, think about ourselves, make decisions about how we can be, that looks satisfying or seems tempting because it's recreating some of that ordinary control.
Yeah, I mean, his notion of a wanton seems to be an intuitive one, where he says we know that there are these people who do not reflect. Essentially, yep. A wanton is someone who is just driven by their first order desires and do not have desires about their first order desires. So that is a powerful intuition that he drives his account. But you'd agree with that, right? That a wanton is somehow lacking in control?
A wanton does not exercise ordinary control or manage what I sometimes call managerial control with respect to their own desires. The story I'm going to end up telling about evaluative control, the wanton may well exercise evaluative control. Okay.
I'm going to interrupt again, but I often find, reading your stuff, well, of course, this is a phenomenon in all of philosophy, but as your previous interviewer said, a lot of the things that you like to work on are important basic ideas like blame, forgiveness, things that are part of the common sense folk language. But at the same time, you give stipulative definitions of them that seem to make them more narrow. So, for example, control. It seems to me that it's perfectly natural to say that the robot is controlling it, or the microchip is controlling it. Yep. But you would say that's not the kind of control I'm interested in, that lacks something. That's not real control. Because your notion of control seems to be very intellectual.
Well, so I don't want to rule out ordinary control. But my quarry is the free will problem.
Right.
And so one way to think about that problem is to say, well, the thermostat, say, controls the temperature in the room. And if we were content with that as a form of control, there'd be no question about whether we control things. But if a compatibilist were to try to say, don't worry about determinism, don't worry about any of these things, because look, we control things, then someone like Kant would say, no, so Kant famously said, that's the freedom of a turnspit, right? Someone could easily say, that's the control of a thermostat, right? That's not real control. And so I take my task to be, in part, to say what it is about humans that we control our behavior in some way that is more than the control of a thermostat. So I don't want to deny that there's a perfectly good use of the idea of control, such that the thermostat controls the temperature of the room.
But you also want to say that that's not enough, and you want to say why it's not enough. It's
right.
not enough because it lacks what we care about. What do we care about?
And I want to do it in two stages. So I want to say it lacks self-determination. So the thermostat is in control of the temperature, but it's not how it controls the temperature is not up to the thermostat. Whereas I want to say how we control our environment is up to us, in a way, and that's the idea of evaluative control. We bring things to be as we would have them to be by answering questions for ourselves. But that idea of being self-determining or answering questions for yourself is going to be broader than that. There's going to be creatures that are capable of that are not yet morally responsible. And so it's going to be a two-stage process, because in addition to being self-determining, you have to be capable of showing respect or disrespect. You have to be capable of standing in certain relations, and now we're coming back to the relational aspect. Standing in certain relations with others such that each of you can hold the other to expectations that amount to standing in relations of possible respect or disrespect.
So the incompatibilist says, okay, you compatibilists, you've got control, but you don't have self-control. And you agree that by our ordinary notion of control, we do not have self-control. That would require an infinite regress, being able to, and that's the problem that Frankfurt seems to face. You don't just need second order, you need third order, and so on. So your solution is to say, well, we need to expand our notion of control to include what you call evaluative control, and according to that, we do have the control over ourselves that the incompatibilist says we can only get by sort of severing ourselves from the causal web of the universe, or by entering the noumenal realm, or whatever. You say, no, we don't need to get involved in that panicky metaphysics. It's perfectly okay. We just need to broaden our concept of control, or maybe you think that it's not broadening, it's just you're bringing out what we already thought, and that's evaluative control. So could you explain that?
Yes. So, and it's, it won't get what the incompatibilist wants, right? So the regress.
But you can never satisfy those guys.
Right. The regress is real. But the thought is that, maybe the best way, the most intuitive way into this is to think about the active-passive distinction. And so there are things that we are clearly active with respect to, raising your right hand, going for a jog, running for office. Those are voluntary actions.
I don't know, some people can't stop themselves running for office at the moment.
That's true, so maybe we need to qualify that a little. And then on the other extreme, things that just happen to you, having a headache, aging, being subject to gravity, right? Those are purely passive. But I think that a very large and important class of things about us don't fit well in either category. And the easiest example is belief. So when you believe something, you might think, look, I can't believe it will. I can't believe voluntarily. It's not up to me what I believe. I just have to believe what's true, what's obvious. I just open my eyes and I end up with beliefs as though they were passive.
This is the criticism of Pascal's wager.
Yes. Yes, that you can't believe at will this way. On the other hand, believing that the butler did it is not like having a headache. It's not something that just befalls you. It's not. In fact, even perceptual beliefs, as opposed to perceptions, I think are up to you in a way. If you don't believe your eyes, if you think that what you're seeing is an illusion, you're not going to believe your eyes. That's the thing we can do. So it seems that, and the mark of this is that it's apt for people to ask you why you believe, and when I'm asked why do you believe the butler did it, my reply, and this is a point made by Richard Murrian, my reply is going to refer to things separate from me in space and time. Right? I'm going to talk about the butler and his access to the home and his motives for revenge, and I'm going to give a case that supports the conclusion that the butler did it, which is very different than if you ask me why I have a headache. There I'm going to tell you about things to do with my psychology, my brain, that explain this pain. So belief, it seems to me, is not voluntary. You can't just believe anything you want to. On the other hand, it's not. You're not just passive with respect to believing. It's up to you in some way. So that, I think that's true of everything about us, that anything about us that reveals our take on what's good or true or important or worthwhile or lovely or irritating will have just this same in-between or alternative relation to activity and passivity.
Okay, I'm going to push back, as I'm sure you get an awful lot of pushback on this point, because what I could say is, for one thing, you sound like a philosopher, which is only right and just. But if you ask some people why they believe what they believe, that really pisses them off. And they are going to get defensive, and they are going to get annoyed with you, and they're going to shut down, because they think people presage things by saying, as a Christian, I believe such and such. And what they mean is, I have adopted this identity, and it comes with a set of beliefs, and my spade is turned at that point. You know, I do not have to justify this to you. Now, philosophers, of course, are appalled by this. But on the other hand, philosophers, if you ask them why you believe them, you would say, well, I am compelled to by the facts of the matter. And again, so in both cases, you're kind of compelled. You are, now you say, believing is something we do, rather than, like, as you say, a headache, something I have. But I mean, again, if I'm pushing back, I could argue that's kind of an artifact of language, and we don't really have the kind of control over beliefs that is what I want. Suppose I'm greedy. I don't want to be an incompatibilist, because that never made sense to me. But I want more than that, because I want to say the only way in which I can refuse to believe what my eyes are telling me is if I have other reasons for doing so, like having been given Descartes' meditations at a formative age, something like that. So what do you say in response to that? That your evaluative control, that's not really control. That's broadening the term too far.
Yep. So I want to accept the idea that it's if you think the word control should not go to anywhere that you don't have a kind of discretion or voluntariness, then I agree. You won't want to call it control. So I have to do work to explain why I think you should let me call it control. But I mean, I don't want to get hung up on the verbal dispute.
Okay.
What's important is that that it's up to you in a way that it reflects your take on things. So what I need is a division between facts about you, like your bone structure or your birthplace, that you're stuck with, and facts about you, like your beliefs, your resentments, your fears, your cares, your concerns, that are what we might call essentially contestable, that are things that you can be asked why, that are things that you can be criticized for, and that set of things, they're not voluntary. So it's not that you can just wheel back and decide, oh, I want to stop caring about academic freedom. It's really getting in the way of my life that I care about academic freedom, which you might think, right? I want to stop caring about democracy. It's really bumming me out. So we can manage ourselves out of cares. That's something we can do. And we can manage ourselves into and out of beliefs. That's something we can do. But if we had that kind of just discretion, that direct voluntary control over a state of mind, that state of mind couldn't have the significance of a belief or a care or a resentment.
Is there maybe there are two senses of belief, right? There's belief in the sense of a mental state of mind, that I can be aware of, and whereas there's also the sense of beliefs where I can say, you don't really believe that. And the reason why you don't really believe that is because I happen to know that you have these other beliefs that are inconsistent with that. So we can disagree about that sense of beliefs. And that's a belief that is not really a mental state of yours. It's an abstract object.
Okay.
Do you see what I'm saying? And what you're talking about is the mental state?
I don't think we can make that distinction.
Okay, so there's not as if, on a Cartesian theatre view, the first kind of beliefs is if I could crack open your skull, like, oh, there it is, there's your belief. Whereas the other is something that I attribute to you, and that, if I'm Daniel Dennett, I can attribute it to a thermostat maybe. But it's not something that is necessarily realized in your neurochemistry. It's just like a proposition or something like that.
So now we're getting into why it is that this view does have implications for mind, for philosophy of mind. It seems to me that belief and intention are the purest case of this, but that a wide variety of our folk philosophical, ordinary mental concepts. Well, let me stick with belief and intention. It seems to me that they have their first home in our lives, in our social lives. That any non-solipsistic, language-using, rational, whatever that means, set of creatures sharing a world of limited resources will have need and use for a way of picking out what other creatures represent as so and what other creatures plan to do. And that those concepts will come freighted with expectations that the other will make sense. And those expectations will be both predictive and demand-like. So I want to be able to predict what you will do, and if you don't make sense, I'll give you a hard time about it. Right. So that's kind of a social heavily socialized concept of what belief and intention are. If you have a stubborn representation as of something being so that won't enter into this network of expectation and demand, I don't think that deserves to be called a belief. That's a delusion, it's a fixation, it's a hallucination, it's something other than a belief. For it to be a belief, it's got to be the kind of thing that interacts in this way.
So the Clintons murdered Jeffrey Epstein. What would that be? If I claimed to believe that.
So I think that's going to be so you could say, I don't know, I just keep having this thought, it's making me crazy. That might not be a belief. But if you come to me and say, look, we've got to do something because the Clintons murdered Epstein, that's a belief. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be well grounded or. I do think an awful lot of philosophy, especially in the areas that I work in, gets off on the wrong foot by thinking that reasons are good reasons or beliefs are justified beliefs or something like that. Like, there can be a lot of going wrong, and it still can be a belief.
Okay, yeah, I keep sidetracking you. Let's go on to your discussion of responsibility, and start with what you say is a sort of the nearest thing we have to a sort of folk concept of responsibility, which you call the merited consequence notion. Could you explain that?
Yes.
Good.
So there's a massive philosophical literature on moral responsibility, and most of it focuses on praise and blame. And most of that conceives of praise and blame as consequences deserved for good or bad choices, or good or bad behavior, or good or bad character.
I'm sorry, where the consequences might simply be me feeling a negative emotion towards you. It doesn't have to be, when you say consequences, it doesn't have to be to blame you, I have to hit you, or I have to put you in jail.
That's right. But it does seem to me that it's thought of as the sort of thin end of that wedge, right? So when you're a kid and you misbehave, you get sent to your room or what have you. If you're a criminal, you get some sort of criminal consequences, punishment. If you're a grown-up and you make a big mess, you have to clean it up. And then the interpersonal reactions we have, like again, Strawson's reactive attitudes of resentment or distrust, end up being conceptualized as another one of those. So it may be that I can't make you clean up the mess, but I do feel badly towards you over what you've done. And then the question becomes, in the literature, when is that appropriate? When is it okay to have these negative reactions to people in response to their violations or failings? And I think, so that's what I think of as the merited consequences conception. It's thinking of all of the reactions, all of the negative reactions we have to moral failing as a kind of maybe very thin penalty, or rarefied penalty that's imposed in response to violation or failing.
And what is wrong with this view?
That's not how grown-ups interact, right? So
Or should.
Yeah, exactly. So it seems to me to be missing, and this connects back to the voluntary, the fact that we need this category that's neither voluntary nor passive. Um, if you offend me and I resent it, if I'm thinking of my resentment as a penalty or sanction that I'm imposing on you, then I'm engaged in what I would call guilt tripping. And guilt tripping is a thing we do, but it's not necessarily just to resent what you've done to me isn't necessarily to send you on a guilt trip.
Yeah, guilt tripping I think of as I have to, in order to guilt trip you, I have to produce the response in you. So it's not simply me resenting you,
Right.
it's you feeling bad.
Yep.
So, and I can guilt trip you without actually caring. I can think,
Yep.
oh, he did that, she did that thing to me. I know that that's the kind of thing that she might feel guilty about, even though it didn't really bother me, and I'm
Right.
going to use that.
Yep. Sure. Yes. So instead, I think that these reactions are natural reactions to the quality of wills that the quality of will that others have to us. So to think that to resent what you've said to me, say, is the way that the fact that you matter shows up in me in this relationship that we're in. So in a recent piece I wrote, I said to find yourself at the on the wrong end of blame. If by blame we mean, I think blame's a terrible word. I think blame is a terrible word to use for what philosophers mean by this.
Yeah, because we talk about I blame Trump for everything, or I blame the Santa Ana winds for the fact that my kids were fighting.
Well, yeah. So we can talk about. Yeah, I actually think it's really. I think blame is really interesting. So we can talk about that. But if you find yourself on the wrong end of resentment, I want to say it's more like having a hangover than it is like being sent to your room. And so having a hangover is a negative consequence of drinking too much, but it's not a sanction that anybody's imposing on you. And so if you resent what I've done to you when I've wronged you, that's a negative consequence of my poor behavior. It's crucially unlike a hangover in that you're active on your end of it. It's not just a passive happening like a hangover is. But you're not necessarily imposing a negative consequence on me.
Yeah, I liked your analogy of distrust.
Yes.
So maybe.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that might be better. So if someone is unreliable, if they regularly forget to be available for appointments, for example, then you might distrust them. But the distrust isn't the question of whether the distrust is fair. Isn't a question of. Sorry,
This is where you were getting into the discussion of blame. For example, your problem with the regular way that philosophers treat blame is they say sometimes blame is unfair, and you say because of their misunderstanding, their misconception of blame, this is why they think blame can be unfair. But when you understand blame in the way that you think it should be understood, it becomes like distrust, and you can never say it's unfair. Well, I think you can say it's unfair of you to distrust me, but that's only if I'm mistaken. about it's not to do with whether or not I had a bad upbringing, right?
Yep.
I can distrust somebody. I distrust somebody, and you say, "Well, come on, it's because their parents, fetal alcohol syndrome, abused as a child," and I can say those are very good reasons to distrust the person.
That's right.
And so you're saying blame should be like that, and that the penalty. It's only unfair if we attach a penalty to it and the correct understanding of blame. Now, how is blame different from resentment on your view?
Blame in the ordinary sense or in the philosopher's sense?
Let's go with philosopher's sense.
So for philosophers, resentment's just one possible way to blame.
Okay.
I could resent, I could be indignant, I could give you the cold shoulder. I think that there's any number of ways in which your failing could show up in our relationship, our interpersonal relationship, that would get called blame, and resentment's just one piece of that.
That's one of the things I miss from the ordinary language philosophers, and sort of Strawson wasn't really one of them, but he was around those guys that, like Austin, that they make such razor fine distinctions. Oh no, that is not resentment. That is,
Right.
And it's like, Grice was the worst one for that. But so blame is a more blanket term, of which resentment is an example.
Right.
Now, it's also the case, though, that resentment is kind of a cognitive notion for you as well. It's not just... So, for example, I think you have a cat.
Yes, she just...
Not?
Yeah,
right?
she just walked through.
It's not something your cat could do to you?
Uh-huh.
I mean, we could talk about my cat. My cat resents me because I forgot to feed her, or for example, my wife, when she first came to graduate school, had to leave her cat behind because the apartment she moved in didn't have cats. And then when she came back to get it a year later, it stiff-armed her for a good hour. And I can say, it resents her.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you would say, no, that would be misusing that. Cats can't resent in the way that I mean it.
Probably not, but it's not to do with it how cognitive it is. It's that resenting, to resent is to feel offended against or wronged or disrespected. It's to have one's standing. It's to take oneself to have a certain kind of standing and to have that standing violated. And I don't know that that cats are engaged in I mean, they're certainly not engaged in developed kinds of relationships like that.
Maybe dogs.
Yeah, with dogs, I think you get closer to it with dogs. I think they can. I think there's a closer kind of system of expectations that can be mutually understood, and where the violation can be mutually important, not just for the fact that you're not getting your food, but that you've been, your place in this relationship hasn't been recognized. That's the piece that you need.
I liked. It seemed that you could resent from your analysis of resentment. Somebody could resent the fact that you don't resent them.
Yeah.
Could you explain that, for example?
Well, so if so in the paper I wrote long ago on forgiveness, one puzzle is how can you forego resentment in a way that counts as forgiving. And one way of foregoing resentment that doesn't count as forgiving is just thinking the person's not worth your time. And so that's holding in contempt or discounting or so if somebody is just cares so little about what I think or do that my offending them is no is no occasion for them to have any reactive attitude, then that's a way of not recognizing my status as part of the moral community.
Now, this is unrelated, but it's going to bug me. Do you think that is a belief that you can bring about just by itself? Like, do you think that I can decide to de-rank you? So, for example, you know, you are my boss, you diss me, you show me disrespect, and I resent you. And for my own personal benefit, I say this resentment is killing me, you know, it's taking years off my life. The way I'm going to deal with it is to find you in contempt and to remove you from the category of people whose respect matters. Mm-hmm. Can you just make that call? And if so, is that a belief? What is that you're doing there?
Right. So Strawson talks about the objective attitude that we were talking about earlier. He thinks there are certain conditions in which it naturally tends to, we naturally tend to adopt it, such as children and people who are suffering certain pathologies. But then he says we have a resource, we have it available to us as a resource that we can sometimes use. And he says one reason is to avoid the strains of involvement. So the thought is that you can, it seems, to some extent and in limited ways, sort of step away from the reactive attitudes and adopt a more objective attitude. I think we can do that to a limited degree for a limited period of time. That's not the same as believing someone is unworthy of is not part of the moral community, say. So to go to get yourself to that belief, I don't think you can do that by deciding or at will. You can work on, you can do various things to try to manage yourself into it.
You can try to managerial control.
Yeah, you can try to reframe the situation. You can try to think about it from different points of view. You can try, and we do that all the time. If something's really bothering you,
go interview their school friends and find out if they were jerks in school or something like that.
Or try to convince yourself to focus on this aspect of the situation instead of that aspect. So we do kind of. The reframing and reinterpreting that we do is a way of managing our beliefs and our reactions. I don't think it doesn't make them voluntary. The fact that we have to go through all of that reframing and reinterpreting sort of shows that they're not voluntary.
It does seem that one thing we do have voluntary control over is something to do with attention, with where we put our focus, with what beliefs we're going to bring to the fore and what beliefs we're going to background to a certain extent. So you can put aside red flags, for example. People seem capable that, you know, later on when it turns out that they were betrayed by their lover or something, they say, oh yes, I was aware of all those red flags, but I ignored them. So you can, even if you can't control your beliefs in the voluntary way that I want, mm-hmm. You can control your focus.
To some extent, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so your slogan, and I like this slogan, is mattering, not meriting. Would you explain that, please?
So it was what we were just trying to talk about, where I got sort of stuck. So the thought is that the right way to think about moral responsibility, what it is to be responsible, is not to rightly merit or deserve certain sanctions or penalties or consequences, but it's instead to be such that the quality of your will, your take on the world, matters to other people. So for me to regard you as responsible is for me to care about how I figure into your world. For you to regard me as responsible, for you to care about how you figure into my world. And then what it is, I think, to be in moral relations is for us to live in live among one another, caring about, not just caring about how we figure into one another's world, but having some shared understanding of the expectations, the rules that amount to showing one another respect or disrespect.
Right. Now, do you think that this view drops out of contractualism because you are a fan of Scanlon's contractualism, and in fact, I imagine it's because of you that this book was seen on our TV screens.
Yes.
If we were watching The Good Place.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you think that this view, that you have to be a contractualist to have this view, or that having this view is the right view to have, and it leads to a contractualist view, or?
It certainly sits nicely with contractualism. I'm not sure that it. So, and I think one good way into that book you just held up is through its 6th chapter, which is the chapter on responsibility. So there's a way of reading it as, Scanlon, from his initial article through to that book, has been focused on a crass way of putting it is, what's the big deal about moral wrongdoing? What's the significance of moral failing? And his answer is, it's the significance of violating a certain kind of relationship of mutual regard or mutual respect. And so there's a way to read the contractualism as starting with that core thought, and then, working from there to an understanding of what the standards of mutual regard would look like. So it certainly fits well with it. I'm not sure it either falls out of it or requires it. Philosophers are really clever at, fitting things together with other things.
Right. Again, I'm using a jargon term, contractualism. Could you give a little précis of why it's called contractualism and what the core idea is?
Sure. So the core idea is that the moral principles or the moral rules or standards are those that we would agree to under certain circumstances. And so that's why it's like a contract. That's why it's called contractualism. What are the circumstances? Well, they differ for different contractualists. For Scanlon, they're the principles or rules or standards that we would agree to if we were, if we were what he calls reasonable. Reasonable requires, among other things, he doesn't fully specify what reasonability is, but among other things, it requires being committed to finding some agreement with other people who are also committed to finding that agreement. So, to put it more intuitively, what it is to be moral, or the moral rules, are the rules we would agree to if I were committed to and willing to constrain my pursuits exactly for you, so long as you were also committed to and willing to constrain your pursuits for me. So, so what you are looking for is kind of the freedom of each consistent with the freedom of others, or another way of thinking about it that Scanlon doesn't focus on is it's the rules we would come up with if we were all equally powerful and determined to come up with rules. And then what it is to be moral is to continue to abide by those rules, even though we're not equally powerful.
Yeah, and as you put it, it's a minimal conception of morality. Could you say in what way and why that appeals to you?
It's minimal, so it stands in stark contrast with ideas of morality that have to do with a good human life. And so Aristotle thinks it's not clear. I'm not sure. So Aristotle, in thinking about ethics, wants to think about what's a good human life and what would fulfill human nature. That's not what contractualism is interested in. There's other ideals you could have. You could have an ideal of rationality or an ideal of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Contractualism, as a moral theory, is a progeny of contractualism. Of social contract theory as a political theory. Social contract theory as a political theory was born of the need of people who disagree about God and the meaning of life to find a way to coexist peacefully. And so contractualism as a moral theory has that same minimalism to it. So it's meant to enable people who may disagree about their conceptions of the good, may have different and competing ideals of human life, nonetheless to find some way to live respectfully together. In fact, Strawson wrote one other thing on ethics, and it's this little piece called Individual Idea and Social Morality. Maybe it's the other way around. But this is just the thing that he sets up, is how do we, if we want people with competing and even conflicting ideals of for the good human life to be able to coexist in a single society, we need a minimal morality. We need a way of adjusting those ideals, as little as possible, but in a way that makes room for other ideals to be adjusted as little as possible.
Yeah, it's also sounds obviously related to the later rules with the freestanding notion. Now, I met Scanlon once at an APA because I was with someone who was a former student of his, and he told his joke, which probably you've heard, of the difference between morality and ethics. Morality is about sex, ethics is about money.
Oh yes, I think I have heard him say that joke.
Right, so that's not what people come to philosophy for, to find that distinction. Now, you wrote a fairly long piece in a collection of works on Scanlon, defending his contractualism. And one of the criticisms that you take on is by Judith Jarvis Thompson's torturing babies objection.
Right.
So perhaps you could give that and explain why you think Scanlon's theory survives it.
Great. So Scanlon says an action is wrong just in case its performance under the circumstance would be disallowed by principles that no one can reasonably reject for the general regulation of behavior, something like that. That's his formula. And he says that's what it is for an action to be wrong. It's for it to be disallowed by the set of principles we could all agree to. And Thompson says this is insane. Torturing babies for fun would be disallowed by those principles because it's wrong. And Scanlon gets this back to front. He says
so it's the
wrong
Euthyphro problem.
Because it's disallowed. So I think that's a very good objection to raise against Scanlon, in part because it brings out how the distance between his ambition and aim, and the ambition and aim of other moral theorists. So he accepts the criticism. That is to say, he says no. He stands by his theory. He says no. What it is for torturing babies to be wrong is for it to be disallowed by these principles. So the explanatory priority goes in the direction that he said it went in. But what's motivating Thompson's example is that it seems so obvious. It seems so obviously wrong, and it seems horrible. But the fact that something, I mean, so there's two things to be said. One, the fact that something's horrible is not the same as the fact that it's wrong on anybody's theory. So everyone's theory needs you to add something to the horribleness to get the wrongness. And so there's a way in which the criticism is unfair. But then the other piece that it brings out about Scanlon's theory is that it needn't be the case that the wrongness of something is the most important thing about it. So when Scanlon talks about wrongness, he thinks that he wants his theory to capture the kind of importance morality has for those of us who think it has importance. He wants it to capture that, and he wants to show why it normally takes priority in cases of conflict. Neither of those is to say why it's the most important thing in any given situation. It just wants to say the kind of importance it has, and then why it should take priority in cases of conflict. But he can have that while acknowledging that the horribleness might be the most important thing in any given context, not the wrongness.
Yeah, I wrote a note to myself, and perhaps you can say if there's something wrong with this, that Scanlon's view explains why we give the label moral to some demands, but it doesn't explain the oomph behind it. So, for example, the oomph behind abhorrence of torturing babies is not because it's immoral. But Scanlon's theory can tell us why don't torture babies is a moral demand.
That's right.
So it explains. So for him, moral demands are a category that doesn't reduce to the various reasons we have for doing them, or the most basic reasons. So, in other words, he's a non-reductivist about what morality is, but his theory explains what all of them have in common and what makes them part of the moral group, rather than, say, the taboo group or whatever.
Right, and it's a two-level theory. The moral principles are the ones we would all agree to, but the basis for that agreement looks to the reasons for rejecting principles, which will have things to do with pain and pleasure and convenience and ambition. So the wrongness of something depends on the way it affects individual interests, but doesn't reduce to the way it depends on individual interests. So there's a way in which it's similar to rule utilitarianism. So rule utilitarianism is also a two-level theory. It gets criticized because people don't see why they should follow the rules. Once we notice that it's two levels. Mm-hmm. Scanlon has an answer to that, namely the importance of standing in certain relationships. Sorry, that might have all gone too fast.
No. I remember the Williams and what's that Australian guy? You remember the collection Utilitarianism for and Against? Smart. There we go. And his rule utilitarianism collapses to act utilitarianism.
Right.
And you're saying he forestalls that collapse. So for any rule, if it is not the act utilitarian maximizing choice, then we have a more fundamental reason for not abiding by the rule than we have for abiding. But you're saying that doesn't happen with Scanlon because respect is serious enough that that's always going to be a reason. Now,
so you rule out free riding, for example, even though no one would really be harmed if I free ride on this occasion, but it's still a serious wrong. It's far more serious wrong than what's actually at stake if I cut in line and make everybody wait another 3 seconds, because it's showing, it's communicating that that I'm not part of this network of people who are constraining their pursuits in light of the pursuits of others.
Now, this reminds me again of my problem with the status of beliefs, whether beliefs are things in individuals' minds or these abstract entities. This idea of respecting. Can I disrespect someone without them ever knowing it?
Yes.
So, in other words, I can disrespect someone by free riding even if nobody knows.
Yes.
So in that case, it's starting to sound a little bit Kantian, in that, I'm violating a rule that sort of offends against rationality or something, rather than I'm having a bad effect on people.
Well, so in the full-on Scanlon contractualism, the rules are themselves grounded in the fact that we're each according the other symmetric standing to determine what the rules will be.
Okay.
So by violating the rules, I have thereby, with whether you know it or not, violated, acted in a way that does not accord you symmetric standing with me to determine how I will act, to determine the minimal terms of our cohabitation. And so that's what, so respect is still relational, even though it doesn't require your knowledge.
Okay. Now, this is presumably, this all ties back to the title of your larger book, Minds That Matter, because the mattering is related to the respect and the disrespect.
That's right.
I'm not sure that I have a follow-up question for that. You want to tie together a bunch of threads from the various works that you've done. I mean, there's these works on blame, there are works on forgiveness. Now, those seem basically intersubjective, that it has to be awareness, right? Whereas there's also this aspect that it doesn't matter if people are aware. So do you think those are compatible, that you can have both things?
So I'm not a fan of awareness. Kind of in either.
Given the way the world is going,
yeah. Well, yeah. I hadn't thought about it until you put it that way. But both in terms of control. So it's a crucial feature of ordinary control that you have some sort of awareness about what you're doing. Anscombe pointed that out. And it's a feature of evaluative control that that it does not require that same form of awareness.
Right. For example, I can change my beliefs almost as a side effect without even noticing it. By investigating things, it just so happens that I no longer believe that the butler did it because I see exculpatory evidence.
Or so I might have, yeah.
My belief results from other stuff that I've done. But you want to say I have, in some sense, got control over that belief, even though it's just my change in belief has happened to me, I might say.
So I want to say the fact that you didn't notice it is no reason to think it happened to you.
Okay.
So you also might realize that you've decided to attend your own graduation, say. So just somewhere in the background, you made that decision without having to pull it into the foreground, so to speak,
okay.
And think about it. So I'm kind of I argue against the importance of awareness for control in the first half of the book, and then when it comes to forgiveness and blame and that sort of thing, certainly the normal case is the case where people are aware of one another's forgiveness or blame or disrespect or what have you. But I'm not sure that that's essential to it. So a standard thing is, can you forgive the dead? Can you wrong the dead? Can you resent things done at a great, by somebody at a who you're not in communication with?
Or Nagel's in Death, when he talks about people, talking behind your back, harming you thereby.
Yeah, so all of that seems right to me, that all of those things can happen, and so I wouldn't want to insist on awareness there either.
Okay.
But they're still intersubjective. I agree with that. There's still the relation between subjects. But
yeah, because otherwise, why is it important that they be minds? I mean, you could say stones matter to each other without ever being aware of it. Like the top stone in a bridge, the bottom stone in a bridge matters to it. But so your notion of mattering is tied to awareness, or at least consciousness in some sense.
No, it's so.
I mean, at least the capacity.
Yeah. So this is. So I have stayed away. I've tried to stay far away from consciousness as a topic. It does seem to me that people think of consciousness and control and volition and awareness as very tightly held together, and I don't see it. I do think that minds, so stones don't have minds, and I do think it's minds that matter to one another, and maybe minds and consciousness go together. I would just want to be. I don't know about that. Because I don't know what. I'm very wary of consciousness.
There's only so much you can take on.
Yeah.
If you're taking on free will, you can't also be asked to do the other biggie.
But I mean, it is the case that so maybe I can just say a little bit why awareness seems to me misleading. Right? So if I'm thinking about the butler and trying to decide whether he did it, my focus, my awareness in some sense, my consciousness in some sense, is on the butler and things at a distance from me. if I come to the conclusion, yeah, I think he did it, I'm coming to a conclusion about him, but I'm making something true right here at home. But the thing I'm making true is not the thing I'm thinking about. The thing I'm thinking about is out there. The thing I'm making true is here. So there's an indirection to that particular exercise of agency. And so that's why I think I can decide to attend graduation without noticing. Right? It doesn't have to be on screen to be my doing.
It's funny. It reminds me. All of this sounds rather Wittgensteinian, and it's funny that you cite Anscombe and you cite Strawson, who was around, doing his work around then. And I just think of a passage I remember reading from Wittgenstein about expectation, where he describes, do you know the passage where he describes Smith going around, lighting candles, emptying the ashtrays, and it says that he is expecting Jones, so it's always Smith and Jones, is expecting Jones, and expectation is realized not between Smith's ears, but expectation is something that you can say occurred because of all of this evidence out in the world. It's almost as if you can talk in terms of something that sounds like that most people would consider a mental state, or as in non-consciousness terms, and it sounds like something like that is what you would find appealing.
That's stronger than what I want, but it's in the ballpark.
Now I'm going to. Actually, there's a couple of things. Could you just say? You use this phrase, and you don't mean by it what Catholics mean by it, original sin, and why the fact of original sin helps inform your view of ethics.
So what I mean by original sin is standing in contrast to a widely held view that gets put in the slogan that ought implies can. So people widely think that if you can't do something, then you can't be required to do it. Kant used that to argue for a very strong form of freedom. He said, we know that we are, so he's worried about Newton and the deterministic world, and then he says, we know that we're under obligation, and so we know we're free. We can reason from obligation to freedom.
Yeah, can I just say, when you say you can't be required to, you mean morally, not literally forced to, because
that's right.
Sometimes
you can't be morally required to. You can't be you can't be blamed if you don't do it. That's one thing that people mean. Okay. Now people are less sanguine than Kant about our capacities to always do what's right, and so now people think that moral demand or moral obligation, or certainly at least blame, should shrink to fit ability. I think that's not so. If it were the case that moral ability shrinks to fit, the moral demand shrinks to fit, it would make it unlike almost any other kind of expectation that we hold one another to. So the demands of parenting, for example, are grounded in the needs of the child. The demands of policing are grounded in the needs of the community. The demands of being dean are grounded in the needs of the institution. And if a particular parent or police officer or dean is such that they can't satisfy those demands, they're too selfish, they have too much of a temper, for some reason they can't pull it off, the demands don't shrink to fit their ability. And so if you think like a contractualist does, that the moral demands are the requirements of sharing a world together with others who are equally real or equally important, then like parenting or policing, the moral requirements are grounded in other people's standing and won't shrink. But that means, given the hazards and contingencies of moral development, and given that it's difficult to become somebody who can put aside their own screaming needs and allow other people to exist, that sometimes people will arrive at adulthood unable to satisfy the demands that are nonetheless rightly placed on them. And that's what I call original sin. That the idea that you can find yourself in situations in which there's a legitimate moral requirement that you just can't satisfy.
Yeah. So basically, you're saying that being immoral is like being an asshole. I mean, it might not be your fault that you're an asshole, but you're still an asshole. And
Yes.
it might not be your fault that you're being immoral, but you are still immoral. So that's why that informs your, or is connected with your notion of blame. You can blame someone even if it might be unfair to punish them, but because your notion of blame is not the merited consequence one, it's to do with holding certain attitudes, then it's still okay to blame someone.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it's more recent thought I've had, somewhat recent, that that it may be that people actually have different conceptions of, or actually different attitudes. So I've now started talking about resentment plus and resentment minus, where when I talk about resentment, I mean resentment minus. It's a reaction to offense. So in the forgiveness paper, I talk about it as a form of protest to a wrong done. It affirms my standing in the face of disrespect. I think some people think of resentment as what I now call resentment plus, which says not only you can't treat me like that, which is what resentment minus says, but you can't treat me like that, and if you had paid attention and tried harder, you could have avoided this. So if you think resentment has that just packed into it, that that's part of what it is to resent, then when you learn that somebody is subject to original sin, is just too much of an asshole to avoid it, for example, then you're going to think that resentment is now out of place. But one way around that is to think that that's not packed into resentment. That I can perfectly well hold together resenting the chauvinism I've been shown, while also believing of this person that there's not a path for this person to avoid that.
Now, again, I'm struck that your view seems, again, this is an inexact word, but intellectual, in the sense that, would you say that it is true that you could discover, oh, I guess I resent that person?
Yeah, sure. I think that happens all the time.
Whereas I think my gut level version of resentment is it eats me alive. You know, like it is a gnawing feeling that is the most important thing about resentment is, my resentment of him is just driving me crazy. Whereas you're saying, oh yes, I see that I believe that they have disrespected me. I see that, so and so. Therefore, I resent that person. It seems like that the affective component is more important than you.
I see.
You give it credit.
Or
at least in the sketch that you've
presented. Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I mean, so it's also the case that you might come to understand that this gnawing unhappiness that you've been experiencing is actually resentment.
So what I come to understand is how to conceptualize my anguish or my affect. Whereas, so you're not saying that, you're not committed to the view that you can have it without the affect. You're just saying...
I'm not committed to that view. I suspect you can, but I'm not committed to it. But the I suspect you can because I want to say things like, "Oh, I've resented him for years,
Mm-hmm.
but I haven't had this affect for years." But my reason for treading lightly on affect is just that my methodological tools are not those of a psychologist. I mean, my methodological tools have to do with relations of justification and relations in which so I can talk about reasons, I can talk about agency, I can talk about relations of support between considerations and conclusions. And so I think that does give me a handle on some of our emotional lives, but it's just one little handle on it that I don't. And then this thing is much bigger. But I feel like I'm not in a position to talk about an awful lot of it.
I wonder if a contractualist counselor could, get someone to deal with their resentment, saying, "I can explain to you why resentment is illogical, and let's see if the affect vanishes."
Well, so I think, I mean, that's actually a thing that right there in the beginning of that forgiveness paper, that there are conclusions you can come to that should just extinguish resentment. For example, when you learn that it was a mistake, there was no ill will shown. Mm-hmm. It seems like that that revises, I think is the word I use there. You then revise your resentment. That's very different than the sort of process of trying to reframe, where you're trying to manage your way out. That's different again from inducing amnesia about the relevant stretch of history, and so, getting rid of the resentment.
I think children are a very problematic case, of course, because I think when you're raising children like toddlers and so on, they can do things that seem extraordinarily insensitive, and you can genuinely resent them, even though you know this is stupid. They are not capable of intending what I'm taking them to, but they seem like they could be, given the way they behave. So I think that it's hard. You can, I believe that you can have the attendant feelings even while you're telling yourself, this is stupid. And I think, of course, that's also a problem for people like autistic people, who can say what seem like extraordinarily insensitive things, or can appear to disrespect somebody without intending it at all.
Mm-hmm. But the fact that there's that tension between the thought that it seems that they've disrespected me, but they're not capable of that kind of delay of gratification or what have you. That there's a tension between those thoughts, I think, says something about its cognitive aspect.
So suppose my toddler does something that I take as very disrespectful or showing ingratitude, and I say to myself, and I feel this feeling, and then I work it through and I say, well, they're not disrespecting me, but the feeling doesn't go away. Is it no longer resentment because my beliefs have changed? It's just the residue of resentment? Or is it always a mistake to talk about the feeling as resentment?
So it's definitely right. So I mean, an even clearer case is the person who is afraid of getting on an airplane but believes it's safe.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, um, uh, so on the one hand, they're definitely afraid. On the other hand, they definitely keep telling you that they know that it's safe.
Right.
The fact that we feel a tension between these, you know, like it's not like having indigestion and believing the airplane is safe.
See, here I would say, again, there's the two kinds of belief, because in the one sense, they can say, yes, I honestly don't believe that it's going to crash.
Mm-hmm.
But then you would say, yes, you do.
Mm-hmm.
You do believe it's going to crash
Mm-hmm.
because you're afraid.
So I want to say both of those things are true.
So you both believe and don't believe. Okay.
I mean, that's you know, people are complicated. We can find ourselves in lots of conflicted situations. Conflicted. I mean, sorry. So I want to say you both are committed to and committed to its negation. Anyway, so whether we want to say that one motivation for talking about questions and their answers is to move away from what was called a while back judgmentalism about emotion. So people used to think emotions have beliefs built into them. If you think of belief as its own, as a state of mind with its own functional footprint, so to speak, you might not want to insist that emotions have beliefs built into them. But you might still want to think that they have a kind of representational commitment to them that is something less than belief.
Yeah, well, your work covers so many areas. This book is going to be huge.
Right now it's about 300 pages. I would like it not to get any bigger than that.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up because otherwise I will keep you talking for hours. And what I normally ask is, what do you think philosophy's role in the public life is? Now, for you, this has a particular connection because you have been a consultant for a TV show.
Mm-hmm.
Were you partly motivated? Do you think that something good for philosophy has come out of that?
Yes, I do. I think it's wild and wonderful that contemporary philosophy has gotten a little bit of product placement on television.
It's weird. It's not just one. There's two sitcoms. Like there's another one called AP Bio, where the main character is not just a philosophy professor, but obviously they have a consultant because he drops in real philosophy once in a while.
Mm-hmm. And there was another with, I think it went on and off the air with Tim Robbins as a philosophy.
Oh, I missed that one.
So I think it's good. And do I think good things have come out of it? I mean, certainly there's some interest in philosophy on the part of students and people that I've encountered. But I think there's a much bigger role that philosophy can and should be having in public life. And I think the kind of political and cultural upheaval that we're in the midst of, it would be really terrific if one aspect of that was that philosophers became a little less insular and a little more engaged in the wider dialogue, which I think is actually happening in certain ways.
In England, there are in England more than here. There are pop philosophy books. There's a guy called Stephen Law, who is at Oxford now, who wrote a very good philosophy book for about a 12-year-old. It was called the Philosophy Files because the X-Files were popular at the time, but I don't know if it's called that now. Do you think that's what we need? I mean, because philosophy is not studied in high school, and there is a little bit of a danger that someone could see The Good Place and say, oh, Chidi represents philosophy, and that's just, not necessarily one of the good options.
Right. So I guess I want to say all of the above and more. So I'm happy to have Chidi. I'm happy to have the Philosophy Files. A man I went to graduate school with, Aaron James, has a book that he that I've actually used in my classes called
Assholes? Yes.
Assholes of Theory.
In it, it says, it gives us a paradigm example, real estate magnate Donald Trump.
Yes, well before the election. There's a follow-up, of course. Assholes, a Theory of Donald Trump.
I haven't seen that one.
Yeah, the publisher did not miss the opportunity to repackage. Right. But that I think he's done it's more or less contractualism. So when you said, oh, being immoral is like being an asshole, you might think, no, it is being an asshole, and that's kind of what what that book's about. But it's it's available, it's readable. For a general audience. There's the New York Times has the Stone, the column that seems to me a good development. Kate Mann has her book on misogyny.
There's also a phenomenon of YouTube. So YouTube has been taken over more by the alt-right, or it was, and in response to that, we have a lot of more left-wing people who are employing philosophical tools but in a very poppy way. I mean, I wonder if philosophers need media training. I mean, your training in your non-profit perhaps could be put to use. I mean, why do you think they came to you about The Good Place? What was it? He was genuinely the show. What Mike Schur is it? The showrunner. Was he genuinely working through philosophical problems in his head, and he wanted help in thinking them through in this way?
He genuinely was. It was remarkable. So I'm not exactly sure, but so he had this idea. It was before he had assembled his team. He was still developing it, and somehow, I don't know how, he came across my web page, and on my web page I had a description of a paper that I still haven't gotten out for public consumption. The paper at one point was titled "Why You Can't Be Good by Trying." The idea of the paper is, Aristotle says, roughly, fake it till you make it, like you need to habituate yourself. But if practice makes perfect, why wouldn't you become really great at faking it? like there's got to be some transition from faking it to the genuine article, and why would practice help with that? So that was the topic of the thing, and I think that's and he was interested in that. So I think that's why he contacted me to have a conversation about his idea. But I mean, I actually think we need a lot more collaborations between philosophers and non-philosophers who are either TV people writing narrative, journalists. So since my involvement in that show, I have had a number of interviews by journalists asking me about the show, and a couple of them I think have done an amazingly good job at translating the things I said to them into popular journalism in a way that I don't think I could. So, I mean, I'm trained to do this other thing, then it gets too involved, you know. So I think more collaboration between, and my collaboration with Mike Schur, part of what was extremely gratifying about that is, you know, I walked away realizing not only do I know a lot of stuff, but if you put me in a conversation with a smart person who has a project like this, I can package it for him. You know, I can actually, he doesn't have to do all the reading and work through all the things that I've spent my lifetime doing, but I can deliver to him, you know, pieces of it in a way that
you deliver to him and he delivers to the general public. And
and then, you know, and a bunch gets lost in the way in the process. But so I do think philosophy needs to be more engaged. But I think one way for us to do that is to find partners in collaboration whose expertise and training is in communicating in ways that are not the ways we communicate.